you awake, I have the coveted spot of the after lunch presentation, which everyone loves. But I'm going to try to keep you awake by showing you lots of pictures, and hopefully I can keep you a little entertained. Just in general, I'm going to follow the outline of what's in the materials, but the presentation is going to be different. And Nicole is going to post it on the website or email it out because I've added lots of pictures and illustrations to hopefully. A lot of these concepts are difficult to understand, and I found that a lot of people have misconceptions about what's really going on in oil and gas production. So I poached a lot of different diagrams from various presentations I've attended, and tried to find some that highlight and simplify, but really tell you what's going on. So I'm going to start with an overview of the industry processes, kind of a timeline of how production occurs from when an oil and gas company starts looking at a prospect down to refining. Now, I don't do a lot of downstream, so refining or distribution. I know more upstream, which is at the wellhead, the production, exploration, leasing, and a little bit of midstream. So this will focus more on those upstream issues. And it'll focus mostly on oil and gas, despite the title of mineral law. Then I'll go into a discussion of some of the stakeholders. The stakeholders are what really makes oil and gas litigation interesting, and go through probably fairly quickly a list of various topics. I guess I shouldn't say all because it's very difficult to get everything in there, but some of the things that lead to litigation and what makes oil and gas litigation unique, the complexities of it, and hopefully we'll have time to go through a couple of case examples. I shifted my presentation a little bit in the materials. I was going to talk about, as far as when the case examples go, insurance and indemnities, but after the presidential debate the other night, I decided to include that Migratory Bird Act case. And then at the end, I'll take questions because we've got time. Just to give you an idea about my background, I am a Wyoming native. I've lived there all my life except for 2 years after undergrad that I lived in Denver, and I'm an accountant, so I'm a nerd on top of it. And my family was primarily employed with the minerals industry or the agriculture industry. So that's kind of my personal background, my personal life. I do represent a lot of landowners and a lot of industry. I don't represent environmental groups. I will try to keep my personal biases out of this, but I think that it's only fair that whenever you listen to a speaker or whenever you look at materials, there's such a huge abundance of materials on the internet that you can learn more about all of these topics. You should always keep in mind who the messenger is, because there is a lot of bias built in there. So decipher the messages based on who is conveying them. My practice is primarily transactional and with a good dose of administrative law and some litigation support. So while this is on litigation, my main job is avoiding litigation, and that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. But just to get an idea, how many people in the room consider themselves transactional attorneys? And how many are litigators? There's a lot of people that didn't raise their hand. Okay. I included this at the last minute. I just added this over lunch because just as a perspective of comparing Wyoming to South Dakota, this is from a game and fish, Wyoming game and fish presentation that was identifying the primary areas of development in Wyoming. You'll notice that the Powder River Basin has 34,000 That's because those are coal bed methane wells, a lot of them, and they're much smaller wells, so there's more of them. The wellhead for a coal bed methane well is about the size of that tank. So you don't see it as much. They're not the huge rigs that you can see from miles away. The Pinedale Anticline, in comparison, produces a whole lot of gas. There's only 600 wells there. They're on 270 pads, so that means that they're doing about 2 to 3 wells per pad. So they drill down and turn off in different ways. But those rigs are very big. They drill very deep, 10 to 14,000 feet deep in some circumstances. In comparison, coal bed methane bottoms out usually, I'd say, around 2,500 feet. But that can vary depending on which hole they're going for. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how much activity we've got in Wyoming. And before we talk about oil and gas litigation, I just want to give kind of a backdrop of why this industry is unique. And when I say industry, I'll use that term a lot. Typically, we use it, especially when we're talking about regulations and legislative activity, we use it to refer to oil and gas, hard rock minerals and mining, energy industry, sometimes, but often to a lesser extent, alternative energy and renewables, because those industries are often driven by different factors, not necessarily as much of energy production, but they're highly, highly influenced by tax credits and the environmental community, and a lot of what they do is above ground, so there's differences there. The energy industry and oil and gas is different from other industries, primarily because it's commodity-based. It is similar to the agriculture industry because of this, but by saying it's commodity-based, it's because the price is determined by the function of the market as a whole. Oil producers don't say, I want you to give me $150 for this barrel of oil. The purchaser says, okay, today the price is $90 a barrel. There are long-term contracts that you can enter into, but that's based on predictions of what the market will do. So the commodity is supplied without differentiation based on quality. Oil and gas is highly, highly regulated. This is driven primarily by protections for the environment and protections for individuals, such as mineral owners and landowners. There's significant, we feel the impacts of the industry significantly in our daily lives because of transportation, our reliance on it for transportation, energy and jobs, and of course it's heavily, heavily political, and not just in our country, but worldwide. This is just an example of kind of how influenced the industry is based on. This is a graph that I put together for a rulemaking proceeding to talk about what the impact of additional regulation could be. But you can transfer this easily to different technologies and other things that impact cost or impact the price. So one of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about the industry is that increased regulations will decrease the usable life of an oil and gas well. And increased and lower price technologies can increase the life of the well. And that's what we're seeing with hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. This is just a diagram of, or a picture, an illustration of what is under the ground that we're looking at. So there's a misconception that there's like a swimming pool of oil under the ground, and that's just not true. It's different layers of different geological structures. There's sand, there's shale, there's water aquifers, but there's always rock in there. And so in those different formations, some of them are porous, some of them are impermeable. That's where oil, gas, and water are stored. So to start with the processes and timeline, and I'm going to kind of go through this quick because you probably have a basic understanding of it, but it just helps to go over it to put it in perspective. Before any drilling starts, the geologists have to sit down and determine where there's a prospect. So they look for petroleum systems, they look for geological indicators that there's the potential for a play. I think that nowadays there's a lot more evaluation of restrictions on development, and that's where the legal implications come in. A lot of areas, we see it in Wyoming a lot with Bridger Teton National Forest, the Wyoming Range, the places that are restricted to from certain levels of human activity due to various, typically federal laws, such as the wilderness study areas or wilderness areas, or national parks, national monuments, and forests, national forests. Then, after they determine there may be a prospect, there's exploration, development, and appraisal. So oil and gas companies will go in, do geophysical surveying. That involves sending sound waves down into the ground and evaluating what those different formations are. And that's the first area where they're really starting to touch the land, to interact with the landowners and the mineral owners. As far as this stage, the geophysical companies, they may or may not be going in on areas which have already been leased. So they usually go in and ask for permits to just come in for a few days, run their trucks, their bumper trucks across the land and record geophysical seismic surveys. One of the big implications here is that information is highly confidential, highly proprietary. I recommend to my landowner clients that you don't allow a geophysical survey in before you're leased. Because if they go through and find that there's not a good potential for production there, then they have that information now. They are in a superior position and you're not going to get a lease. And then once that information is gathered, they develop a plan for how they're going to explore the field. They might see some exploratory wells, wildcat wells. Wildcat wells are wells that are drilled in a field that there's not been production from before. And that information, again, is highly confidential. The Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission typically keeps that confidential for about 6 months. And then if they find oil and gas there, they go into leasing. This, again, is the picture of the development areas in Wyoming. And as an example of the restrictions on development, here is the game and fish's overlay of areas of endangered or threatened species habitat. So that's just one of the considerations at this stage, what exactly they're going to be able to do. Will they be able to go in and conduct seismic? Will they be able to go in and drill? Is it worth going in to drill an exploratory well if there's going to be significant restrictions on further development? And I'm sure you have heard all the same things and have the same issues that we do with sage grouse. We in Wyoming have a big push to take steps to protect sage-grouse habitat so that it does not become listed as threatened or endangered. Because in that event, the Endangered Species Act severely limits the ability to conduct any type of activity near those habitat areas. So after a field has come in with production, then it will be developed and produced as a whole. There will be continued drilling. At the wellhead, the processes that you see are heating, treating, separating. Water management is a big issue for coal bed methane, and it's not as much typically for other types of production, but water is always an issue with oil and gas, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't know. There's usually a lot of water produced with oil and gas. In fact, in the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, about 95 to 98% of production is actually water. And so for every barrel of production, 95% of that is water. The other 5% comes out as oil that can be sold. So water management can be a significant challenge. That's where I have spent a lot of time in my career, and that's why I highlight that. But in the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming, which is northwestern Wyoming, they have been producing there for almost 100 years in some circumstances. And they've been able to make great use of that water. It's separated at the wellhead and then treated to remove all of the oil. And then the water is used by landowners, ranchers, and farmers to either irrigate and produce alfalfa or to water their livestock. So they've got significant reliance on that water and significant increased production because of it, agricultural production. Downstream of the wellhead, the terms that we use are gathering and sometimes processing. So from multiple wells, there's pipelines that gather the product. Usually gas is involved with gathering. Oil, sometimes it's piped, a lot of times it's trucked, sometimes it's even conveyed by train. And it's stored in tanks at the wellhead. But gathering is lower pressure pipelines going to a point where it might undergo some processing in the midstream area to remove water, to remove non-methane gases. And then midstream, the term you'll hear for midstream is transportation, and it's the higher pressure pipelines. And sometimes exploration and production companies are involved with midstream if they're producing in an area that doesn't have any transportation, any pipeline structures. Sometimes they will partner with other companies and participate in that. So just more complexity to the business relationships that arise out of oil and gas production. And then downstream, there's refining and processing. You all know what oil refining produces as far as gasoline, diesel products, and then distribution to the customer. Terminology is really important and creates difficulties in oil and gas litigation because for several reasons. There's a lot of very specific trade language. Some of it is really technical and comes from various areas. There's a lot of scientific knowledge behind all of this production, and the technology is constantly developing. So to stay on top and understand what's going on is a task in itself. There's also a lot of specialized legal terms, which we heard a lot of those this morning, like the Duhigg Rule, the Q Clause, Mother Hubbard Clause, pooling and unitization. I don't think we talked about the Mother Hubbard Clause this morning, but that just adds, if someone leases a tract of land that maybe is bordered by a river, and that river moves, the lease basically says that that additional land is added back to the lease. There's also a lot of acronyms, and a lot of that is caused by governmental and regulatory involvement, the alphabet soup of the federal government, but some of it is industry developed. So HPV is a common term held by production. That's when the lease carries over into the secondary term because they actually achieve production out of the land. And APD is an application for permit to drill. Those are just a couple of examples. The very common governmental acronyms are the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, the EPA, oh, I don't have Fish and Wildlife Service, FWS. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, and that determines, that restricts development on federal land to a great degree until you've undergone processes of evaluating things like endangered species, habitat, archaeological resources in the area to be developed, and impacts to air and water, and to the local social and economic conditions. And there's a lot of slang, which kind of makes it fun. These are just a few examples: doodlebugger, and jug hustler, and worm. I found a lot of these definitions from the Schlumberger Oilfield Glossary online. It's a great resource. It's in the materials and in the PowerPoint. And these change, and they're used differently a lot of times. So, for example, if you have a case that comes in, I had a case at one time where there was an accident on a drilling rig, and the terms that were used in there, like rig floor, the V-door, the mud pump jumped, things like that, you really have to try to sort through and figure out what those mean and what exactly they were saying. Some terms they appear to be slang, but they actually have fairly technical definitions, but they're also used in a lot of different ways. Rat hole is an example of something that's used commonly, but there's 3 different definitions in Schlumberger's glossary. One definition is a bigger hole that's drilled at the top of at the surface to fit all of the drilling apparatus down lower into the ground. And then a couple definitions are little holes drilled outside the main hole down lower in the oil well. Wildcat, that sounds like a slang term, but that's a very entrenched term as far as, I think it's been mentioned here a couple times today, that it's a well that's drilled in an area that hasn't been proven. Frac job, that's hydraulic fracturing, which is very, very technical. A gunk plug, that's bentonite or some sort of mud that's put into the hole to plug a hole. And then other terms, you don't even realize that they're oil and gas specific. Fishing involves sticking something down the well to try to get something else that's got caught down there out. A lot of us heard junk when the BP Deepwater Horizon well blew out. They were throwing stuff down there to try to plug it. And gun barrel. If you see that in a report, it's kind of hard to figure out what they're talking about. There's really very strict restrictions on guns on site, and most surface use agreements will say you're not allowed to bring firearms on a landowner's property. But a gun barrel is a tank in which oil and water are separated, basically. One of the other confusing aspects of oil and gas is this reference to conventional versus unconventional production. I pulled these definitions from the Schlumberger glossary and some of them from the Energy Information Administration, Energy Information Administration. And, but basically, conventional reservoirs are reservoirs that we've been producing out of for a long time. And they look like this, the red areas that I have circled in red. It's places where oil or gas, going back to how they're formed from hydrocarbon material that's been rotting under the Earth's crust. And conventional resources are developed from the migration of that oil and gas upwards. Some places just have gas with very little associated oil, and other oil reservoirs almost always have associated gas. I would say always. So it's Conventional reservoirs are basically places where oil and gas has migrated up into a sort of pool. But remember, it's not like a swimming pool. It's in a porous reservoir that the oil and gas can flow out of easily. So there's references to oil pool. Sandstone is commonly a place where gas is found in these conventional reservoirs. Sands, oil sands, gas sands, and most commonly the conventional resources have been developed through vertical drilling rather than directional or horizontal drilling. So these are easy to recover because you can just drill straight down in and start pumping out, and those resources go towards the well bore and will go up easily. Unconventional reservoirs are not so easy. And unconventional is